What's going on, guys? This is Mark Reel Jr., the Father's Rights Attorney, host of the Father's Rights Playbook podcast. And tonight we have an extra special episode. We have one of the panels, the panel on parental alienation from our book launch event earlier this month. On this panel, you're going to hear from attorney Sean Kohlmeyer, attorney David Pizarra, and senior trial attorney from Real Father's Rights, Brian Mayer. Now on to the podcast. I hope you guys enjoy.
Okay. All right. Okay. Let's get right started. Okay. So, Brian, why don't you take a second and go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us all a little bit about you and who you are and what you're doing, and then we'll follow up with David.
Thank you. My name is attorney Brian Mayer. I am an attorney with Real Father's Rights, so it's my pleasure to be working with Mark. I'm certified as a family law trial advocacy specialist by the National Trial Advocacy Board, and parental alienation is a passion of mine, and I can't wait to have a discussion about it today.
Great. Thanks. David.
Hey, Sean, Brian, good to be here, guys. My name's Dave Pizarra. I'm with Men's Family Law. I'm also the founder of the Union of Dads, where we've got online courses to help dads represent themselves. I've been doing family law for the last 23 years, representing primarily dads. And parental alienation has been one of those elements that just continues to run right through, it seems like, on some level, every case these days. And I'm glad to see that we're attacking it and trying to make some headway in reducing it.
Yeah. David, Union of Dads. So your aims primarily at helping pro se dads?
That's the goal for Union of Dads and for my dad's law school. It's designed to have online courses so that dads who can't afford lawyers, because after they've been through the ringer of the domestic violence restraining order, after they've been through the ringer of 4 years of parental alienation, they're left with what do I do? And so I saw a need to try and help them out with that. And so I'm coming up with an online course to help dads represent themselves.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a difficult ringer. I mean, I've been through it too. Still going through it. All right. So let's just dive right in. Why don't we go straight into we talk a little bit about what parental alienation is. Brian, why don't you start off with that give us a lay definition of what it is. I mean, I think, the name says something and the words mean something, but, give us a lay definition.
Well, I'll start by saying that, first of all, right now, all we have is a lay definition. You won't find parental alienation syndrome in the DSM. You won't find it in any psychology books. Right now, there's a working understanding, though, of what it is. We don't have a syndrome attached to it, but generally speaking, parental alienation is a term that we use to describe a pattern of conduct by a child's caregiver, a minor child's caregiver, designed to intentionally interfere in the relationship between that child and a parent. Now, I don't say other parents, because really parental alienation can come from any child, any caregiver of the child. It can come from a grandparent or a guardian. But usually we see it as one parent alienating the other. And usually we will see it can actually affect any parent. It's not just women doing it to men. Men can do it to women as well. But either way, it's absolutely harmful to the child. And that when we say parental alienation, we're talking about that pattern of conduct intentionally interrupting or attempting to interrupt the relationship between the parent and that child.
Thank you. David, how do we see that expressed? What's the sort of things that a pro se dad that doesn't have a family law lawyer would be looking at to say, hey, wait a minute, I think the parental alienation is happening here?
Well, there's a couple different ways, and I just want to expand on what Brian was saying, that the definition of parental alienation is that interference, but it also comes with degrees. Many couples, when they first break up, there's that early stage of just hurt feelings on both sides, and it's your mom's being difficult and your dad's being a jerk stuff, and that tends to fade after a while. And that's not really the parental alienation that we're looking at dealing with here. Now, what we're looking at is the more long-term stuff that takes more like 6 months, a year, and it's the consistent denigration of the other side. It's trying to erase the other side from the child, and it's alienating them in such a way that they feel completely validated in eliminating the other party. And it can start with something as simple and what seems like not a big deal as literally starting to use someone's first name as opposed to being called dad. And it's that first step of, okay, now we're going to like put space between the relationship of dad and human and try and make that like, well, that's John. So it's not your dad, it's John. And so mom might always refer to John that way, or grandma, or whoever's doing the alienating, as Brian pointed out, would be doing that to just sort of start pushing that person out of the child's consciousness. And then it goes into the false allegations, the false reasons for why they don't like that person anymore. Well, they make me eat tuna. Like, I don't like going over there because they make me eat tuna. Like, what? Like, that this makes no sense. It's this completely illogical reasoning that the child's engaging in that pushes the other party out.
Right. These nonsensical reasons. Right.
Right.
You know, I like to when I first talk to I'm trying to find my flashcards here on my desk, and I haven't found them. When I first talk to a parent about parental alienation, I like to direct them to Dr. Bill Bernay's article on the 5-factor model. And I usually tell them, you know, go read this thing, make flashcards. That's why I was looking for them. Learn the lingo. What do you say, Brian, on you know, when it comes to educating the client or educating, you know, a pro se dad?
Well, there's a lot there, but I think generally speaking, first of all, when you have a client or a father who is the victim of parental alienation, they may not know what to call it, but they understand what's happening. They see what's happening. They feel what's happening. And the first thing in terms of how to advise the client, it really depends a lot on where they are in that process, how long it's been going on, how serious it is. Sometimes we see, as David was saying, you know, just we see little things like, okay, that's John, it's not dad, it's John. We see those sorts of things. When a parent is perpetuating this, they're sometimes, or I'm sorry, when a caregiver is perpetuating this, sometimes they set limits for themselves, and sometimes it's just all out. I'm going to erase this person from the child's life. And so it really just kind of depends on the situation. But what I will say is that when you have a situation, and this actually ties in nicely to an extent what Ryan was finishing up with before we started this segment, when you're dealing with a situation where you are really feeling those effects of alienation, where this has progressed to a point where now the relationship is disrupted, maybe the child won't talk to the parent, the child believes false things about the parent. When we've gotten to the point where the disruption is either complete or approaching complete, it's a hopeless place for a lot of fathers, a lot of parents in that situation. And what I tell them is, number one, don't stop. Because what you can do is, as a parent, you have to realize the things you can control and the things you can't control. And someday that child's going to be an adult again. Someday that child is going to look back and be like, did that really happen? Or they'll remember, they'll be able to think independently. They'll have their own ideas. They'll be able to look back and, if not sort things out, at least question the bad information that they were fed in this process, and be receptive to new information. And I've spoken to a lot of parents who went through this season of alienation, and their kids got older, they entered into adulthood, they reached out to them, which a lot of times happens, and they're given that opportunity to amend the situation. And the question that you don't want to be asked by your child and not have an answer to is, why did you give up? Why did you stop? Why did you just throw in the towel? If you can go back to the child when the process is done, regardless of whether you have the best attorney in the world, whether you're self-represented, regardless of whatever evidence has been fabricated against you, you want to be able to, for one thing, you want to be able to go back to the child and say, I tried, and here's what I did. I did everything I could. you want your hands to be clean. Secondly, second, with regard to perseverance, is I can't tell you how many times I've had a situation where a parent is facing this kind of where it really rises to the level of parental alienation, and they just feel so defeated, and they just want to throw in the towel, and they want to quit. And if they just keep pushing further, they can start making progress. They can get further along. They can start to turn things around. The other side they get exhausted too in the process. Believe it or not, they can get exhausted too. And there are plenty of times where it will come down to who has the greater will here, which is greater, the other party's hate for you or your love for the child. And just keep pushing forward. Don't give up, even if you don't see a path at the moment. Don't give up. Be thinking, what next steps can I take? How can I change things? How can I approach? Keep pushing forward. So for those two reasons, just keep pushing forward.
I'll picking up on just your little tidbit there about the kids who come back and how they look. I'm going to drop a little bomb here on Mark's show. I'm an attorney in Seattle, and I've been going through a nightmare divorce for several years that has involved parental alienation. But I'm a child of parental alienation myself. I was a kidnapped and alienated kid. My mother and my paternal grandmother had a nasty fight for custody. My mother lost. Rather than surrender me, she disappeared and hid me from my parental family for 35 years. Yeah.
Dude.
Yeah. When I went away to law school, she handed me a stack of documents, and I didn't have time to deal with it because I was going to law school. And those documents ultimately led me to, after law school, to turn around and find my family. And by that time, my father had lost his mind to senility. So I never really got to meet him. I did not meet my biological father until I was 40 years old. But I can attest to what happens with a child as they start to go into, late teenage and early adulthood. They do look for some of their roots. I mean, this is before the internet. I would spend time in libraries looking through white pages because I knew his name. I hired a private investigator at one point in time. David, to ping pong back and forth, what do you recommend to fathers that are in this sort of a situation as to what's often called in leaving breadcrumbs behind to how to find back to you?
Well, there's a couple things, but if I could, I want to go back to the five-factor model.
My audio.
Sean, you're coming through loud and clear for me.
No audio.
What I wanted to say was I created a parental alienation checklist. And if you go to pachecklist.com, you can get a checklist, and it's the difference between parental alienation and high conflict divorces. And in the parental alienation checklist, you can see what is a child actually doing or not doing that rises to the level of parental alienation. And so when you're looking at that, then you can then try and create those breadcrumbs to reestablish that relationship. And one of the things I tell dads to do is to always keep the door open. As odd as it sounds, register their name on domain.com so that you can create a website for them, and you can put it behind a paywall or a security wall so that the child can actually access whatever documents you want to upload. So Brian, I think it's just you and me at the moment. So we're going to have a little quick conversation here. I don't know if you've ever done that, but I've several clients where I've registered the kid's name, and dad has gone through and created the website for the children. And so when they're old enough and they reach out, they can actually go back and see like, oh, wow, here's all the text messages. Here's the birthday messages. Here's the Christmas cards, all that stuff that dad wanted to send to the kid that may have actually been sent, but never received because it was intercepted and destroyed. And have you ever done anything like that?
Yeah, and it really, obviously it depends on the situation, but I think what you're really hitting on here is the fact is, I will say this, we're so fortunate, parents in this situation, as a mitigation against this, are so fortunate that we're now living in an information age where you can just go on the internet and search for someone like that. And
Yeah.
if you want to be found, then if you're looking for someone who wants to be found, then it makes it all that much easier.
So much easier.
And hearing Sean's story here, I'm listening to this and just thinking to myself, how different would his outcome have been? How different would his life have been if he had the access to the tools that we have now? So,
very different, really, really very different. When I call it the phone call that sort of changed my family's life. When I found his phone number, I picked up the phone. I called what was his new wife, of 30 years after my mother, and I found out that he had siblings and that I had cousins, and I built relationships with those cousins that now I have all of these family relationships, which sadly my son is missing out on. But it absolutely it would have been a very different arc on how that would have happened. So yeah, you're right. It is a very different time. I mean, David, could you distinguish for people who are still unfamiliar and new to this concept, what the distinction is between alienation and estrangement?
Well, estrangement in my mind generally is that just pushing away. It's that early stage in the divorce where there's that, like, your dad's being a jerk, your mom's being difficult. It's not that like trying to really sever the relationship. Estrangement is just, I don't want that person in my life for the moment. And eventually that calms down. In my experience over 23 years, where I've seen a lot of this, and sometimes it takes a few months, sometimes it takes a few years. I've had cases where it's literally years for them to finally get past the anger and the hurt. But eventually it will do that with estrangement. With alienation, it's this like global thermonuclear war. I want to completely eradicate the other person as much as possible. And it's a difference of degree in my mind.
I know none of us are psychologists here, but either one of you have any thoughts on what it is that motivates an alienator?
Oh, I'll let Brian start, but I definitely have opinions on this one.
Well, I'll tell you what, I don't think there's any study on this, but I'm sure that David and anyone else familiar with this would agree that there is definitely a high correlation between personality disorder and the individual perpetrating this sort of behavior. So, in terms of the character, in terms of the personality going to this, I think it can come from a couple of different angles, but they're all unhealthy. They're all very unhealthy.
So my answer to this is it's real straightforward. If you're dealing with a borderline personality, which is generally females, or a narcissistic personality, which is generally the males, it's two sides of the same coin. They're both difficult and there's no cure. And in general, what I have found is that borderline personality females come from a history of child abuse, and they have this weird relationship with their own mother. It's this push me, pull you love relationship where the father has been driven out and it seems normal to them. And so they've got this desire to like enmesh with people because that's what happened with their own mother, which is why the father is being pushed out. When the baby first comes, mom has already been like this with the father in that early relationship. And as soon as the baby comes, what ends up happening is his mom moves away from the husband or boyfriend and wants to enmesh with the child. But you can only be enmeshed with one person at a time. And so to do that, you have to drive the other person away in order for the parent to enmesh with the child. Normally, what we see is a lot of moms doing the enmeshment with the child and trying to push dad out. But statistically, the reality is that it happens about probably 60-40. And the thinking is that the reality is that's probably more of an economic difference is what we're seeing in the courts. And in reality, it's a 50-50. It really is equal between the genders. And it's just an economic of which cases are being prosecuted and fought. And that has to do with who's got the resources. And in today's society, frequently, the men end up having greater financial resources often to fight these cases. And that's what happens.
Yeah,
what you're it's all about their own perspective, how they're being
psychology.
I'm sorry, Sean, I was speaking over you.
That's okay. What you're referring to is the 50-50 split in between male and female and alienators is in the psychology. The psychology is evenly spread between the genders.
Correct.
Even though it might not be expressed evenly in the court system for various reasons.
Correct.
What's going on, guys? It is Mark Reel Jr., the father's rights attorney, and on August 7th, I am releasing my first book, The Father's Rights Playbook. My introduction to family law was my own family law case and going through the family court system. And in doing that, my eyes were open to the injustices that occur and the trials and tribulations that fathers are put through. So it was a personal experience, and then my eyes were open to this broad systemic issue, which has inspired me to build this firm and now write this book.
I'll springboard a little bit on what you said about that it's often children who suffer. It's a little bit broader than child abuse. It's just an adverse childhood experience, a serious trauma. So, for instance, in my case, my ex-wife, her father died when she was 10. So she grew up without having a father in the household. I don't think it's any surprise that she, exhibited the exact behaviors you're talking about and shoved me out the door when he was 8, 9, 10, because that's how she sees what is normal.
Yeah.
So, moving a step beyond the psychology here, can we start to talk a little bit about actually talking about how one deals with alienation in court? Let's talk about the problem with the term right now. What's going on outside in the DV world, inside the court systems, about just use of the term, and I'll refer to my reference here. So, Brian, why don't you pick that up for us?
Gladly. And not to go backwards, but I might also add antisocial personality disorder as another underlying culprit to what's going on. But basically, here's what I'll tell you. I've seen, at least here in Southern California, I've seen a shift in the courtroom culture as it pertains to parental alienation. If you'd asked me about this maybe 10 years ago, I would say that if you use the term parental alienation in court, you're going to, if the judge doesn't roll his or her eyes, it's going to they're going to be tempted to do it, simply because there's a lack of familiarity with the concept. It a lot of times it would come across as people playing armchair psychologist, and there's a sort of, okay, here we go again. What are they going to be complaining about? Where's this going, sort of thing. It has gotten better. It really has gotten better. I think at this point, I still generally recommend against using the term parental alienation in the courtroom unless you hear it out of the judge's mouth first. The reason being that it's not, people a lot of times will get caught up in these labels. Oh, this is parental alienation. Oh, they're a narcissist. Oh, they're, whatever it is. What matters is not the label, but what's actually going on. And the label may help others who are familiar with it understand what's going on, but the judges are not psychologists either. And I'm sorry to say, oftentimes they've never touched a family law case or custody case in their life before getting on the bench.
Right.
So you're dealing with people who, frankly, are definitely not qualified to be throwing these terms around and expecting them to really understand the scope of it, having seen the different shades of it. So I generally recommend just steering away from the term altogether and instead just describing what's actually happening, because anyone can understand the description. The label, they're going to start wondering what the heck you're talking about. They're going to be asking the wrong questions from the bench. So I think that answers.
Focusing on the behavior of what's happening,
yes,
rather than playing armchair shrink and sticking a label on it.
Yes, and I would extend that not just to parental alienation, but anytime you feel like the other parent has something diagnosable happening internally and it's contributing to the problem. You don't want to draw any sort of scrutiny. And I've seen judges ask the question, "Well, are they diagnosed with that? Did you diagnose them? What are your qualifications?" Almost just picking a fight because it's lunchtime and they're hungry and grumpy. Okay, so it's yeah, definitely stay away from the labels. Really focus on the behavior.
Right.
It's if I could jump in here, one of the things that I think to kind of pivot off of what Brian is saying is we have such greater resources lately. In the last 10 years, there have been so many books written. Ashish Joshi just wrote his Litigating Parental Alienation, produced by the ABA.
Mm-hmm.
Great book. I mean, I've got a great interview with him on YouTube talking about it. He's probably the top PA lawyer in the country on this one.
Mm-hmm.
But as we get educated as lawyers, we then have to in turn educate the judges on it. Because as Brian said, they don't know what the heck they're doing. These people are coming in straight from probably some, Democratic or Republican fundraiser. They got appointed by the governor and they're thrown on the bench and like, here, go deal with 43 divorce cases your first day and figure it out. It's like, no, family law is a little bit more than that. And when you get into the really high conflict stuff and then into the PA, it's even harder for them to understand because so many of them just have no personal experience with it because they've led pretty normal lives to get where they are. Then all of a sudden they're dealing with this insanity of a borderline personality that doesn't understand the word no,
which they can't recognize, which they can't even recognize.
Right. Exactly. And so we can't use the term PA. We have to educate the judges on what's actually happening and its impact on the children, because oftentimes the judge will be like, I don't care. What's the problem? I don't see how that's going to impact anybody. But it's the long-term impact, which is where we then have to frequently bring in the experts to explain to the judge, here's what's happening, which is why we have to go through all of the child custody evaluations, have to go through the testing, have to do the MMPI, have to do the personality evaluations to figure out here's what's happening, Your Honor, and why it's going to impact the children long-term. And that then becomes the domestic violence, which you need to then deal with.
Yeah, which is daunting. I mean, the things that you just rattled off. I mean, a child custody evaluation. Brian, how much does a child custody evaluation in California typically cost?
Well, I'll tell you what, if you're talking about a private child custody evaluation, we really have two levels of it out here. There's what we call a 3111 evaluation, so named because the authority comes from Family Code Section 3111. And we have what's called a 730 evaluation, so named because it comes from Section 7030 of our Evidence Code. And really the difference is the level of investigation from the evaluator. The 730 evaluation will typically include psychological testing, possibly diagnosis. They'll do the Rorschach ink blot tests where, what do you see? Oh, it's a bunny killing a butterfly or whatever. And so it's a lot more in depth.
Don't say that.
Yes, well, I just be honest for the examination. If you're really in question, get someone else to evaluate you before you go in. But even for that lower level investigation, usually it takes about, once it actually gets started, it usually takes about 30 to 45 days to complete. That will typically, these days they seem to be running around $6,000. Now, for the 730 evaluation, those will run, if you're lucky, you'll be done in 6 months. And I'd say they're running on the low end, maybe $15,000. On the high end, it approaches $25,000.
I would up that number significantly.
Okay. What would you put at?
The last one we did was 40,000. And that was pre-COVID. So I'm going to guess that it's going to go higher than that now.
So
they're incredibly expensive and thorough. I mean, you end up with a book. Like I got a book from the evaluator that's 150 pages on what's going on with everybody in this family, the recommendations, what should happen. And honestly, there's like 3 lines out of it that a judge is going to care about.
David, sorry, David, are you Southern California?
Yeah, I'm Santa Monica.
I would bet that I know who your evaluator was just based on that description.
So
We can talk offline about that.
Yeah, offline.
so David, that's a lot of money for a pro se. That's a lot of money for almost anybody. What's a pro se dad to do?
There's a couple things. Instead of doing the evaluation, one of the things they can do, which we did out in San Bernardino, we represented a parent and we got the kid who was 17, but still under court order to go into therapy. And so we got the therapist to just start opening up the conversation rather than having to go through the evaluations, because there wasn't a lot of time left anyways for their minority. So it was like, let's see if we can actually get some reunification happening. And that was obviously not going to be a big $40,000 thing. It's $200 a week, and you get 2 of those a month. So it's $400 a month. Expensive, but not insane. So that was one way in which we were able to do it. The other way, frankly, was just bringing the court request for the evaluation and getting the court order was enough to make the other side step up and be like, wait, maybe there's something else we want to do here. And sometimes just the mere threat of it is enough to bring people to the table.
Yeah, let's talk about that, David. Let's springboard on that. Is there anything that either one of you know about how to rehabilitate a family that's gone down a path of parental alienation for one reason or another, to help move beyond that and to rebuild, quality family relationships, normal divorced family relationships amongst the parents and amongst the children? Anything hopeless?
Honestly, I've seen a couple cases where the kid comes back to the alienated parent and maintains some relationship with the alienator, but frequently they become so disenfranchised from the alienator when they realize what's happened because of the pain of the loss. They recognize they lost however many years that was, that they then turn on the parent that was alienating. And frequently that's the problem, is getting that relationship repaired. And it's not easy to do. And I've seen it once or twice, but in limited circumstances. How about you, Brian?
Well, I'll tell you, it's when it comes to part of it depends on the alienator to an extent. If the alienator doesn't move past whatever led them to undertake the alienation, they're really not going to be able to have a cohesive, separated family unit. You can't. You're talking about someone who doesn't want to play by the rules, who really isn't particularly cared about honesty. They're willing to use really dirty means that hurt their child to inflict the alienation. So if until something changes inside of them, there's really not going to be anything that's going to, of their own will, play nice or try to have a normal relationship. The only thing that really works for individuals who are still in that dark place, frankly, is force and the threat of force. And when I say force, I'm talking about consequences through the court system. And that can be, oftentimes that can be in the form of contempt. Okay, you get alienators tend to feel like they don't have to comply with court orders, or if there's any weakness, any chance for to circumvent a court order because maybe it's not specific enough, then they'll take that opportunity. And they really have to, the only thing that's going to make them oftentimes do the right thing is fear of consequences. So in terms of, overall, the prognosis for any sort of rehabilitation or repair that involves the alienator is very poor. And I would say the alienated parent really has to be looking at, should be really focused on how to, they should be focused just on the relationship with the child, and then to the extent that the other parent is involved, what they can do to mitigate further interference.
Yeah, I'll speak from my own experience. I mean, when I realized what my mother had done, and I mean, because I always knew I had a, I always knew that my biological father was out there, but I didn't know that, basically everything that she told me about him and his family and all of that was a complete lie. By the time I realized that, I mean, the level of anger that I had at my mother was, really quite profound, and it completely changed our relationship. If she hadn't been so near to death, it would have been a very different relationship. But I mean, it seems like the point that both of you are making slightly different ways, and I think I'm making this as well, is that the alienator does these things. They're abusing their child, they're abusing their family, they're abusing their former partner, but they're doing so at the risk, long term, of their own relationship with their child. That's going to come back around on them.
It is. And sadly, that's part of their problem, is they have such a high level of self-hatred and insecurity and such a fear of being isolated and alone and abandoned that they end up creating their own worst fear.
Right.
They drive people from them and then blame them for not being there.
Right. If we could briefly talk about how, because I advocate a lot that the court systems make these situations far worse than they should be. That when you wind up in a situation like this family would be best served by talking to therapists and other mental health professionals and relationship advice, and instead they wind up in this highly stylized gladiatorial fight. Can speak briefly about how the courts make the situation worse than it necessarily needed to be.
Well, I'll take this one to start. Here's the problem. The system that we have is designed to answer questions, okay, legal questions. This works fine when you have a situation where you're dealing with like a breach of contract, if someone is in an auto accident, or even in a criminal justice system. The system is designed to get to the right answer, not to the quick answer. So for those other things, you can take all the time you want, basically. It doesn't matter if it drags out for 4 years, because when you get to the ends, there's still money being handed, there's still justice being done, people are still paying. But when you're dealing with custody, you have kids who are growing up and they're missing segments of their childhood with their parents because the system can't respond in a timely manner, because it can't get to those answers. Then compounding it, you have the situation we talked about a little bit earlier. Most of the judges on the bench really have never touched a family law case in their lives. Oftentimes, the family court is kind of the least desirable assignment, judicial assignment. So you're talking about there are seniority issues that come in. The new guys come in. Not only are they new to family law, they're new to the bench altogether. So they don't know what they're doing. They lack courage because they're so worried about this, that it's very easy to just leave things intact and be like, okay, well, I'm not going to change anything and I'm not going to get in trouble because I haven't created a new problem by doing that. So you're dealing with a lot of individuals who oftentimes don't have the competency to implement the orders that are needed, and lack the courage to implement the orders, even if they did know what those orders should be. So you are fighting to an extent an uphill battle, oftentimes just trying to get the court to do something about what's going on. And for me, in my experience, it's not so much, I see less of a problem with the courts doing the wrong thing as it's a problem of them not doing anything or not doing what needs to be done. It's a restraint holding back. I will use the word cowardice because that's how I see it.
100%.
We got 7 minutes here, David.
Everything Brian just said, I think, is 100% true. And then I want to add on top of that when you look at the whole world of family law, like, look at it as a bell curve. You got the really easy cases on this side, and you got the really hard cases on this side, and the vast bulk in the middle is like, okay, there's some issues to be dealt with, and judges make some decisions, and we just move on. If you look at the majority of that, people figure it out. The majority of divorces, the majority of custody cases never see court because people figure it out. Courts are really only dealing with maybe 10, 15% of all of the really big divorces. And of those, we're really only looking at, again, maybe like 5 or 10%. So it's this really tiny percentage over here that's parental alienation, super high conflict divorces. And the court's not designed to deal with that. It's designed to deal with this bulk, the majority of stuff. It's that these little outliers that cause all the problems because they take up the majority of the court's time with useless stuff that they're not figuring, they don't know how to figure out to fix it because they got no training on it. So their answer is push it on somebody else. Like let the psychologist deal with it. Let the parent plan coordinators deal with it. Let the guardian ad litem or the minors council deal with it. Like let's throw a Band-Aid on it and hopefully long enough will go by and then I'll be off the bench and somebody else will have the problem.
Right. Kick it down the can. Brian, in our last few minutes, I thought maybe we might talk a little bit about the ethics of the sort of the attorneys that are driving cases like this. I'm sure all of you have seen, attorneys that you're like, oh, great. Now we know what's going to happen. Brian, what to do?
So I have to apologize. I'm not sure they understand the question.
I do. I can take this one.
For it, David.
I got this one. I have the blacklist, the list of lawyers that are so horrible to work with. I tell my client, I will not take this case because that lawyer is so horrible. They're going to cost you an extra $250,000. They're going to destroy everything. And they don't have any ethics. And what they are doing is purely for money. And they are doing just bogus motions just to drive the bill, just to drive the anger, just to create the conflict, because that's what makes money for them. I've got a whole list of them. And I think they're horrible, horrible people because I see it happen way too much in court. We're dealing with people's lives. We are dealing with people's families, and we should have an ethical obligation to find the quickest, smoothest way to find peace for these people. Even if that means they never talk to each other again, at least it's peace. The problem is that there's too much money involved because these lawyers are willing to gin up people's emotions because when you're dealing with a borderline personality or a narcissistic personality, it's all about them and they don't care what happens and they're an easy target to just get cranked up and then you're off to the races.
Yeah.
That's my rant.
We've got about 4 minutes left here. So Brian, just give us a minute each of, what are your words and thoughts for both the alienator and the alienated parent?
Easy. For the alienator, it's going to come back on you. You're not going to win. Ultimately, you're going to make everybody miserable, and at the end, it's going to come back on you. To the alienated parent, keep pushing forward. Most of the time, your child will come around at some point. Don't give up.
David, if you can springboard on that, on what Brian just said, and say then, what do you think if an alienator realizes they're an alienator, what should they do, and what should an alienated parent do when they realize they're alienated?
Well, the alienator needs to get into therapy to deal with their core issues because what's really happening is they're playing out their childhood traumas. That's what's going on. It's unresolved stuff that they haven't dealt with. And to the alienated parent, it's as hard as it is, you have to just dig deep and keep going. You have to find another resource, one more day to just throw in there, whether it's one more birthday card, whether it's one more text message, whether it's one more just holiday card, whatever it is, outreach to that child to keep the door open. Because as Brian said, they most likely will come back. Most people do come back.
Yeah. So Mark gave us a 2-minute warning. So Brian, go for it. Give us 60 seconds, and then David, 60 seconds.
Okay. Well, I think ultimately what it really comes down to is when you're talking about parental alienation, when you're the alienated parent, I really recommend that you talk with other parents who have experienced the same thing. And it's so much easier now. There are fantastic social media groups, Facebook, various other avenues where you can connect with other people who are going through the same things. And I think really importantly, if you do that, you're going to encounter a lot of people who successfully got through it and came out on the other side. You're going to need that encouragement. You're going to need that inspiration. And just remember always that you're doing this for your child. If your child had cancer, you would wait by their bed. You would wait on them. You would not give up on them. Your child has a cancer in their life, and you need to not give up on your child just because it's hard. Even if your child can't see what's going on right now, your job as the parent is to not give up.
Yeah, I love my son. I'll never give up on him, ever.
Yeah.
David.
So I would say two things. One, if you have questions, whether it's parental alienation or high conflict, just go to pachecklist.com and you can get my checklist to figure that out. And if you're looking for support, go to isnaf.info. It's ISNAF. It's the International Support Network for Alienated Families. It's isnaf.info. It was formulated 15 years ago by me and a therapist who decided that she wanted to do something. And it's been around a very long time. They have support groups for parents. They have trainings. There's lots of resources there. And the last one is you can go to pasg.info. It's the Parental Alienation Study Group to get information and resources, access to other therapists, access to other lawyers, access to other parents who are all fighting the same fight to get the support you need.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was an awesome panel, guys. So much great information. Sean, David, Brian, thank you so much. And I'll talk to all you guys soon, but thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate you having me on. Take care.
What's going on, guys? It is Mark Reel Jr., the father's rights attorney, and on August 7th, I am releasing my first book, The Father's Rights Playbook. My introduction to family law was my own family law case and going through the family court system. And in doing that, my eyes were open to the injustices that occur and the trials and tribulations that fathers are put through. So it was a personal experience, and then my eyes were open to this broad systemic issue, which has inspired me to build this firm and now write this book.